The rain came down hard that Thursday evening, drumming against the windows of the Riverside Community Center like an impatient crowd. Inside, everything sparkled under the bright lights. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the marble floors were so clean you could see your reflection in them. This wasn't just any building. This was where the wealthy families of the town came to show off their talented children, where business owners held fancy charity events, and where, once a year, they hosted the most prestigious talent competition in the entire region. Tonight was registration night for the annual showcase, and the lobby was packed. Young musicians in designer clothes stood with their parents, clutching expensive instrument cases. A teenage girl in a silk dress practiced her vocal scales in the corner. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12 sat at a bench, his fingers dancing across his phone as he reviewed video recordings of his own flute performances. Everyone here looked like they belonged. Everyone looked polished, prepared, and confident. That's when he walked in. He was maybe in his early 40s, though it was hard to tell. His face was weathered in a way that made him look older, with deep lines around his eyes and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. His jacket was thin and faded, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, and it hung loose on his thin frame. His jeans had seen better days, frayed at the edges and stained with what looked like paint or grease. But it was his shoes that really stood out. Old sneakers, the kind that had walked thousands of miles with the soles starting to separate from the fabric. They squeaked against that perfect marble floor with every step he took. The conversations in the lobby didn't stop exactly, but they changed. Voices dropped to whispers. Eyes followed him as he made his way toward the registration table. A woman in a pearl necklace pulled her purse a little closer. A father put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and guided her a few steps to the side, as if making room, though there was plenty of space already. The man clutched a piece of paper in his hand, crumpled and creased like he'd been carrying it in his pocket for days. It was one of the flyers for the showcase, the kind they posted on bulletin boards around town. His hands shook slightly as he walked, and for a moment, he paused in the middle of the lobby, looking around at all the expensive clothes and confident faces. You could see him second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake coming here. But he kept walking. At the registration table sat a woman in her 50s, dressed in a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She had her hair pulled back in a tight bun and wore reading glasses on a gold chain around her neck. She was busy organizing forms and didn't look up when he approached. When his shadow fell across her paperwork, she glanced up with a practiced smile that froze the moment she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked, and there was something in her tone, not quite rude but not warm either. It was the voice you use when you're hoping someone is just asking for directions and will leave quickly. He cleared his throat. His voice came out rough, like he wasn't used to speaking much. "I'd like to sign up," he said. "For the piano competition." The woman blinked. Behind her glasses, her eyes did a quick scan of him from head to toe. "The piano competition," she repeated slowly, as if maybe she'd heard him wrong. "Yes, ma'am." She glanced over her shoulder at her colleague, a younger woman who had stopped what she was doing to watch this interaction. They exchanged a look. "You know the kind that says, 'Is this really happening?' without using any words at all." "Sir," the woman at the table said, lowering her voice a bit, "this is a very prestigious competition. The entry fee is $200 and performers are expected to play at a professional level. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Around them, more people had stopped their conversations. A small crowd was starting to gather, not too close but close enough to hear everything. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. From it, he counted out bills, mostly 10s and 5s, smoothing them flat before placing them on the table. "He'd clearly saved for this, I'm sure," he said quietly. The woman looked at the money like it might be contaminated, then sighed and pulled out a registration form. "Name?" As he filled out the paperwork with careful, shaky handwriting, the whispers grew louder. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. "Is this a joke?" someone muttered behind him. "Does he even know how to read music?" another voice said, followed by a cruel laugh that was quickly muffled. A teenage boy in an expensive suit, his hair gelled perfectly into place, stood with his parents near the wall. He leaned over to them and said, just loud enough for several people to hear, "Well, this should be entertaining. I guess they'll let anyone enter these days." His mother tried to shush him, but she was smiling too. His father just shook his head, looking amused. The man at the registration table kept his eyes down, focusing on the forms. His hand trembled as he wrote, and at one point he had to stop and flex his fingers like they were cramping up. That's when people started to notice his hands. They weren't normal. The fingers bent at odd angles, and there were scars running across the knuckles. Old ones that had healed rough and uneven. They didn't look like hands that could play piano at all. "You're all set," the registration woman said, her voice flat and professional now. She handed him a number card. "Performance order will be posted next week. The showcase is in 7 days. Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. Please arrive at least an hour early." "Thank you," he said, taking the card carefully. As he turned to leave, the crowd didn't part for him this time. They just watched. A few people shook their heads. The teenage boy whispered something to his friends, and they all laughed. Near the door, a group of parents were already talking about him. "Did you see his hands? How is he supposed to play anything? I feel bad for whoever has to perform after him. Talk about killing the mood. Maybe it's for a charity case or something. You know, Make-A-Wish type thing?" The man walked back out into the rain, his number card clutched in those scarred, shaking hands. Through the glass doors, the people inside could see him standing under the awning for a moment, looking down at the card like it was something precious. Then he pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself and disappeared into the dark, rainy night. Back inside, the lobby returned to normal. People went back to their conversations about music schools and scholarship opportunities, and which judges would be the toughest this year. Within minutes, most of them had forgotten about the strange man who dared to register for their prestigious competition. But the teenage boy who'd mocked him kept thinking about it. Not because he felt bad, not yet, but because something about the way the man had stood there, taking their mockery without responding, without backing down, had been strange. There was something in his eyes. Not anger or shame exactly, but something else. Something the boy couldn't quite figure out. It almost looked like determination. The kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. The shelter on Maple Street wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just an old brick building that used to be a church before the congregation moved to a bigger location across town. Now it housed about 40 people on any given night, people who had nowhere else to go. The main room had rows of cots, a shared bathroom, and a small kitchen, where volunteers served meals twice a day. But in the back, down a narrow hallway past the storage closet, there was a room that most people didn't even know existed. It was barely bigger than a closet itself, with space for just one thing, an old upright piano pushed against the wall. The wood was scratched and faded, several keys were chipped, and it hadn't been tuned in at least 5 years. But to the man who sat there every morning before dawn, it was everything. He'd discovered the room 6 months ago, purely by accident. He'd been looking for a quiet place to sit and think, away from the noise and the strangers and the constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. The door had been unlocked, and when he stepped inside and saw that piano, something inside his chest had cracked open. Something he thought had died a long time ago. At first, he'd just looked at it. Then, after a few days, he'd touched one key. Just one. The note had rung out in that tiny room, slightly flat but still recognizable, and he'd started crying right there. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Now, a week before the showcase, he was there again. 4 a.m, like every morning. The shelter was quiet at this hour, just the sound of people sleeping and the occasional cough or snore from the main room. He sat on the worn bench and placed his hands on the keys, taking a moment like he always did, trying to remember what it used to feel like when this was natural. His fingers looked worse in the early morning light coming through the small window. The scars were more visible, the way his left pinky couldn't straighten all the way, how his right hand had limited reach because of the metal pins the doctors had put in 20 years ago. After the accident, they'd told him he was lucky to keep his hand. Said all. Lucky. That word had felt like a cruel joke. He started with scales. Simple C major up and down, the kind of exercise he used to do without thinking when he was 18 years old, and the world had been full of possibilities. Back then, his hands had flown across the keys like they were part of the instrument itself. Now every note was a negotiation with pain, with stiffness, with fingers that didn't want to cooperate anymore. The first run-through was rough, his timing was off, and he had to stop twice when his left hand cramped up. He flexed his fingers, working out the knot of pain, and started again. Then again. By the 5th time, it was smoother. Not perfect, not even close to what he used to be capable of, but better. He moved on to the piece he'd chosen for the competition. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. He'd played it the night before the accident, at a recital at the prestigious music school where he'd been studying. He'd been one of the top students there. Everyone said he had a real shot at a major career. Concert halls recordings, maybe even teaching at a university someday. The Moonlight Sonata had been his favorite piece since he was a kid, and that night, he'd played it perfectly. 3 hours after that recital, his car had been hit by a drunk driver running a red light. Now, trying to play that same piece, his hands felt like they belonged to a stranger. The opening notes of the first movement needed to be delicate, like whispered secrets, but his scarred fingers were too stiff. He had to press harder than he wanted to, and the sound came out slightly harsh. He stopped, breathed, started over. This became the pattern for the next 2 hours. Play, stop, shake out his hands, start again. The piece was burned into his memory from 20 years ago. Every note, every dynamic marking, every subtle shift in tempo. His mind knew exactly what it should sound like. His hands just couldn't deliver it anymore. By the time the sun came up and he heard people starting to move around in the main shelter area, he was exhausted and frustrated. His hands ached deep in the bones, the kind of ache that wouldn't go away with rest. He'd gotten through the first movement maybe 30 times, and it still wasn't right. The second movement was gentler and a bit easier. But the third movement, the stormy finale that required speed and power, he could barely get through without his hands giving out completely. He sat there staring at the keys, and for the first time since registering, he let himself really think about what he was doing. Those people at the community center had been right to laugh. What was he trying to prove? That he could embarrass himself in front of hundreds of people? That he could play a shadow of what he used to be capable of and call it a comeback? He was 43 years old, living in a shelter, and his hands were permanently damaged. The best years of his life were gone, wasted on streets and day labor jobs and just trying to survive one more day. He almost stood up and walked away. Almost decided to just not show up on Saturday, to let them think he'd been joking or had come to his senses. It would be easier that way. But then he thought about why he'd really chosen this piece. It wasn't to impress anyone. It wasn't even about winning. It was about the last time he'd felt like himself. The last moment before everything had shattered. Playing this piece again, even badly, even with broken hands and rusty skills, was about proving to himself that the person he'd been hadn't completely disappeared. That somewhere under all the years of pain and shame there was still a musician. The door to the small room creaked open. An older woman stuck her head in, the volunteer who ran the morning meal program. She was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that had probably seen a lot of hard stories in this place. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly. "I heard you playing. It's beautiful." He shook his head. "It's not. It's rough. I can barely get through it." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "You know, I used to teach piano. Long time ago, before I retired. I've heard thousands of students play that piece. Some of them were technically perfect. Every note exactly right, every tempo marking followed precisely." She paused, looking at the old piano, but most of them played it like they were reading a grocery list. No feeling, just notes on a page. He didn't say anything, just looked down at his damaged hands. "What I heard just now," she continued, "was someone who understands what Beethoven was trying to say. Someone who knows what it feels like to struggle in the dark and still search for beauty. That's what this piece is about. Not perfection. Pain and hope mixed together. My hands," he started to say, but she cut him off. "Your hands have a story to tell. Maybe that's what makes it real." She left him alone after that, but her words stayed in the room like the lingering sound of a struck chord. He looked at his hands again, at the scars and the crooked fingers and the way they shook slightly even at rest. They weren't the hands he used to have. They'd never be those hands again. But maybe they didn't need to be. He placed them back on the keys and started the Moonlight Sonata one more time. This time, he didn't try to make his hands do what they couldn't. He worked with their limitations, adjusted the fingering where he needed to, let the emotion carry through even where the technique faltered. And something shifted. It still wasn't perfect. It probably never would be, but it started to sound like something true. For the next 6 days, he practiced like this. 4 hours every morning, 2 more hours in the evening when the shelter got too loud and he needed to escape into the music. His hands hurt constantly now, a deep ache that kept him awake at night. But slowly, painfully, the piece started to come together, not the way it would have 20 years ago, but in a new way, a way that carried everything he'd lived through. On Friday night, the evening before the showcase, he played it through one final time. When he finished, he sat in the silence of that tiny room and thought about the faces of all those people at registration, their mockery, their dismissive laughter, their certainty that he didn't belong in their world. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong there, but tomorrow he was going to play anyway. Saturday evening arrived faster than he'd expected. The man stood outside the Riverside Community Center at 6 o'clock, a full hour before the showcase was scheduled to begin, just like the registration woman had told him. He wore the only decent clothes he owned, a dark suit that the volunteer from the shelter had given him. It had belonged to her late husband, and while it was a bit loose in the shoulders and the pants were slightly too long, it was clean and pressed. She'd even found him a proper pair of dress shoes, worn but polished until they shined. He looked almost normal now, almost like he belonged here, but his hands still shook as he held his registration number, and his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. The lobby was already filling up with people. Performers were arriving with their families, everyone dressed in their finest clothes. Parents carried flowers for their children. Musicians clutched their instruments, running through mental checklists of everything they'd practiced. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that felt thick enough to touch. He found a chair in the back corner and sat down, trying to make himself as small as possible. A few people glanced his way, but in the suit, without the rain-soaked jacket and worn-out sneakers from registration night, most didn't recognize him. He was just another nervous performer in a room full of them. Through the double doors, he could see into the main theater. It was even more impressive than he'd imagined. Row upon row of red velvet seats, a balcony level that curved around the space, and stage lights that could probably be seen from the back of the room. But what made his breath catch was the piano. A grand piano, glossy black and enormous, sitting center stage under a spotlight. It was the kind of instrument he used to dream about playing on. The kind that cost more than most people's houses. A woman in a headset and clipboard came through, calling out numbers and organizing the performance order. He'd drawn number 17 out of 23 performers. Middle of the pack. Part of him was relieved he wouldn't have to go first, but another part wished he could just get it over with. The first performers were called backstage, and the rest were directed to the theater to take their seats. He followed the crowd, staying near the back, and found a seat in the last row. From here he could see everything, but also felt hidden, safe. The lights dimmed, and a man in an expensive suit walked onto the stage. He was the host, some local celebrity businessman who sponsored the event every year. He gave a speech about the importance of supporting young talent, and how this competition had launched several successful musical careers. Then he introduced the three judges, a music professor from the state university, a concert pianist who'd performed all over the world, and a recording studio executive from the city. The first performer was a 16-year-old girl who played violin. She was incredibly talented, her fingers flying across the strings with the kind of confidence that comes from years of expensive private lessons. The audience clapped enthusiastically when she finished. Then came a cellist, then a soprano singer, then a young man playing classical guitar. Each one was better than the last, each performance polished and professional. By the time they got to performer number 10, a 17-year-old old piano prodigy, the man in the back row felt his confidence crumbling. The teenager played Rachmaninoff, one of the most technically difficult composers, and barely broke a sweat. His fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur, hitting every note with mechanical precision. The audience gave him a standing ovation. That's when he saw them. The teenage boy from registration night, the one who'd mocked him, sitting in the third row with his parents. The boy was watching the Rachmaninoff performance with obvious admiration, clapping louder than anyone else. He looked so sure of himself, so certain of his place in this world. 3 more performers went. A flutist, a jazz pianist who improvised beautifully, and a clarinet player who made the instrument sing. Each performance reminded him of how rusty he was, how his damaged hands couldn't do half of what these young musicians could do with ease. Then they called number 17. His heart stopped. For a second, he genuinely thought about just staying in his seat pretending he hadn't heard, But people were already looking around trying to see who was supposed to go next. The woman with the clipboard appeared at the end of his row, scanning the seats. He stood up. His legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. As he walked down the aisle toward the stage, he heard the whispers start. Recognition was spreading through the audience like wildfire. That's him, the guy from registration. The homeless man. Someone actually laughed, quickly muffled but unmistakable. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at their faces. The stairs up to the stage felt like climbing a mountain. His hands gripped the railing, and he was suddenly very aware of how visible his scars would be under these bright lights. When he reached the piano, the spotlight was so intense he had to blink several times before his eyes adjusted. The audience was just a dark mass of shapes now, but he could hear them, more whispers, scattered giggles, the rustle of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. In the front row, one of the judges leaned over to another and said something he couldn't quite hear, but he saw the concerned look on her face. He sat at the bench and immediately had to adjust it. The previous performer had been shorter, and the bench was too close to the keys. His hands were trembling so badly now that he had to grip the edge of the bench for a moment, trying to steady himself. This made someone in the audience groan audibly. From his position at the piano, he could now see faces in the first few rows. The teenage boy who'd mocked him was leaning back in his seat with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. His mother looked embarrassed, like she wished she was anywhere else. A few rows back, an older woman was shaking her head slowly, as if she couldn't believe the organizers had allowed this. He looked down at the keys. 88 perfect black and white rectangles arranged in the same pattern they'd been in every piano he'd ever played. This instrument was worth probably $200,000. The last piano he'd played on professionally had been worth even more than that. But that had been in another lifetime, when his hands had been whole and the world had made sense. He thought about the tiny practice room at the shelter, the out-of-tune upright piano with the chipped keys, the volunteer who'd told him his hands had a story to tell, the hundreds of times he'd played through the Moonlight Sonata in the past week, each time getting a little closer to something that felt true, even if it wasn't perfect. The theater had gone quiet now. Waiting, not a respectful quiet, but the kind of silence that comes before something embarrassing is about to happen. The kind of quiet where everyone is bracing themselves to witness a disaster. He placed his scarred, crooked fingers on the keys. They looked so out of place on this beautiful instrument, like a stain on something pure. His right hand was shaking visibly, and he knew everyone could see it. He took a breath, then another, trying to calm his racing heart. This was it. In a few seconds he would start playing, and either he would prove that he still had something left inside him worth sharing, or he would confirm what everyone in this room already believed, that he was a joke, that he didn't belong here, that his best days were long gone and he was foolish to think he could ever get them back. The spotlight seemed to get even brighter, the silence even heavier. Someone in the audience coughed. Someone else whispered something that sounded like, "Just start already." He closed his eyes for just a moment, blocking out the stares and the judgment and the crushing weight of expectation. He thought about the music itself, about what Beethoven had been trying to say when he wrote this piece, about darkness and struggle and the search for light, about being broken and finding beauty anyway. Then he opened his eyes, positioned his hands one more time, and played the first note. The first note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. It was soft, almost fragile, the beginning of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. For a moment it was just that one note, lonely and exposed under the spotlight. Then came the second and the third, and slowly, carefully, the opening melody began to take shape. The whispering stopped. Not all at once, but gradually, like a wave pulling back from the shore. Someone who had been rustling through their program stopped. The teenage boy with his arms crossed sat up a little straighter. In the front row, the concert pianist judge tilted her head slightly, her expression changing from polite endurance to something closer to curiosity. His hands weren't moving with the lightning speed of the Rachmaninoff performance from earlier. They couldn't. The scars and the damage wouldn't allow it. But what was coming out of that piano wasn't about speed or technical tricks. It was something else entirely. Each note seemed to carry weight, like he was choosing every single one deliberately, carefully, pouring something into them that went beyond the mechanics of playing. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata is meant to feel like moonlight itself, That strange silver glow that transforms everything it touches. Some people play it with cold perfection, making it sound like a mathematical equation. But the way he played it, with those imperfect hands that hesitated slightly on the wider chords, that had to adjust and compensate for fingers that didn't quite reach, it sounded human. It sounded like memory, like loss, like someone reaching for something beautiful that had once been right there in front of them. In the back of the theater, an elderly woman who had come to watch her granddaughter perform earlier felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't quite explain why. 3 rows up, a music teacher who had been checking her phone put it away and leaned forward in her seat. The recording executive judge stopped writing notes on his pad and just listened. On stage, the man was somewhere else entirely now. His eyes were half closed and his body moved with the music in small, almost unconscious ways. He'd played this piece so many times in the past week that his damaged hands had finally found their own path through it. Not the path his younger self would have taken, not the technically perfect route, but a path nonetheless. His left hand carried the steady, rolling accompaniment, while his right hand sang out the melody. Where other pianists might have played it evenly, he let some notes linger just a fraction longer than they should have, let others fade more quickly, creating a rhythm that felt like breathing, like a heartbeat. Not perfect, but alive. The first movement flowed into the second, a gentler section that was mercifully easier on his hands. Here he found himself relaxing slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. He'd been so afraid during all those practice sessions that he would forget something, that his hands would simply give out in the middle. But muscle memory was a strange thing. Even after 20 years, even with broken bones that had healed wrong, some part of his body still remembered. In the audience, the mockery had transformed into something else. Not quite admiration yet, but at least attention. Real attention. People had stopped looking at their watches. The judges had stopped whispering to each other. Even the teenage boy who had laughed at registration had uncrossed his arms and was now gripping the armrests of his seat, watching those scarred hands move across the keys. Then came the third movement. This is where the Moonlight Sonata stops being gentle and becomes a storm. The tempo picks up, the dynamics get louder. The left hand has to race across the lower keys while the right hand plays urgent, almost desperate melodies in the upper register. It's technically demanding, even for pianists with perfect hands. For someone with his limitations, it should have been nearly impossible. He launched into it anyway. His hands flew across the keys as fast as they could manage, which wasn't as fast as the piece truly demanded, but fast enough. Where he couldn't quite reach certain chord combinations, he adjusted on the fly, breaking them up or redistributing the notes between his hands. A trained ear might have noticed these tiny changes, but what they would also notice was that the feeling never faltered. The anger and passion and desperate energy that Beethoven had written into this movement came through despite the imperfections. Maybe even because of them, sweat began to form on his forehead. His hands were starting to ache, that deep bone pain he'd be and living with for 2 decades making itself known. But he pushed through it, pouring everything he had into these final minutes. All the shame of the past 20 years, all the nights sleeping on cold streets, all the times he'd looked at his ruined hands and wanted to give up, all the mornings in that tiny practice room, teaching his damaged fingers to make music again. It all went into the piano. The teenage boy's mother had her hand over her mouth now, her eyes wide. Next to her, her husband had stopped looking bored and was sitting forward, completely focused. Several rows back, a young girl who'd performed earlier whispered to her father, "Dad, who is he?" On stage, the man's entire body was engaged now. His shoulders lifted and fell with the swells of the music. His foot worked the sustain pedal, holding some notes longer to create depth and releasing others for clarity. His face showed the strain, the concentration, the pure effort of what he was doing. This wasn't effortless genius. This was someone fighting for every single note, and somehow that made it more powerful. The concert pianist judge was leaning so far forward she was almost out of her seat. She'd heard thousands of performances in her lifetime, had played in the world's greatest concert halls, had listened to the most talented students from the most prestigious schools. But there was something about this that cut through all the technical analysis, all the professional judgment. This man wasn't just playing Beethoven. He was living it. The music built and built, getting louder and more intense, the left hand racing up and down the lower keys, the right hand hammering out the urgent melody. His damaged hands were screaming in pain now, but he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. He was too close to the end. Just a little more. Just a few more measures. And then, after one final ascending run that took everything his hands had left to give, he played the last chord. It rang out through the theater, powerful and definite before slowly fading into silence. He sat there, his hands still resting on the keys, his chest heaving from the effort. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his borrowed suit. His hands were trembling worse than ever, and he could feel them starting to cramp. But he'd done it. He'd made it through the entire piece without stopping, without completely falling apart. The silence that followed felt eternal. He lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap, waiting for the polite, obligatory applause that would let him leave the stage and disappear back into his regular life, waiting to return to being nobody again. But the applause didn't come. Not right away. Instead, there was just this enormous silence, like the entire room was holding its breath. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds of absolute quiet. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the theater, a single person stood up, then another, then someone else, and then, like a dam breaking, the entire audience rose to their feet. The sound that followed wasn't polite applause. It was thunder. It was hundreds of hands clapping with real force, real emotion. It rolled over him in waves, and for a moment he just sat there at the piano, completely stunned, unable to process what was happening. People weren't just clapping. Some were wiping their eyes. Others had their hands pressed to their chests. The teenage boy who had mocked him was standing and applauding with everyone else, and his smirk was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. The man at the piano slowly stood up, his legs unsteady, and turned to face the audience. The spotlight hit his face, and they could all see it now. The tears running down his cheeks. The disbelief in his eyes. The way his scarred hands hung at his sides, still trembling from the effort. The applause kept going. Kept building. Someone in the balcony shouted, "Bravo!" and others picked it up. The music professor judge was on her feet clapping. The recording executive was standing. Even the stage manager with her clipboard was applauding from the wings. And in that moment, standing on that stage in a borrowed suit with damaged hands and 20 years of pain behind him, something inside him that had been broken for so long finally started to feel like maybe, just maybe, it could be whole again. The applause finally began to fade, and he managed to make his way off the stage on shaking legs. But before he could disappear backstage, something happened that had never occurred in the showcase's 20-year history. The concert pianist judge, a woman who had performed at Carnegie Hall and the Sydney Opera House, stood up from her seat and walked toward the stage. She took the microphone from the host, who looked just as surprised as everyone else. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying through the theater. "Sir, could you come back for just a moment?" He froze in the wings, his heart hammering. Had he broken some rule? Done something wrong? But the stage manager gently guided him back out under the lights. The judge was standing at the foot of the stage now, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I need to ask you something," she said, and the entire theater had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear. "Where did you train?" The question hung in the air. He gripped his hands together, feeling all those eyes on him again, but this time it felt different. This time they were actually waiting for his answer, actually curious about who he was. "Juilliard," he said finally, his voice rough and quiet. "A long time ago, before—" He held up his scarred hands, and he didn't need to finish the sentence. A murmur rippled through the audience. Juilliard, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. The judge nodded slowly, like something had just clicked into place for her. "I thought so," she said softly. "In 40 years of listening to music, I've never heard anyone play Beethoven with that kind of understanding. Thank you for sharing that with us." She started clapping again, and the audience joined her. He managed a small nod, overwhelmed, before retreating backstage for real this time. He found a corner behind some curtains and sat down on an equipment crate, his whole body shaking. Not just his hands now, but everything. The adrenaline was wearing off and reality was crashing back in. The remaining 6 performers went on stage after him, though he barely registered their performances. His mind was still trying to process what had just happened. The way the mockery had transformed, the standing ovation, the judge's words. It felt like a dream, and any moment he'd wake up back in the shelter, and none of this would have been real. When all the performances were finished, There was a 30-minute intermission while the judges deliberated. He stayed in his corner backstage, not wanting to face the crowd in the lobby. But people found him anyway. First it was a newspaper reporter asking if she could interview him. Then it was the music teacher from the audience asking about his training. Then it was 3 different music students wanting to know his story. He answered their questions as briefly as he could, still not quite believing this was happening. Yes, he'd studied piano for most of his childhood. Yes, he'd been accepted to Juilliard at 17. Yes, there had been an accident. No, he hadn't played seriously in 20 years. The shelter volunteer had encouraged him to try again, and he'd decided to take a chance on this competition. When the judges finally called everyone back into the theater for the results, his stomach was in knots again. The standing ovation had been more than he'd ever expected, more than he'd dreamed possible. But the competition wasn't really about him. These were mostly young people trying to launch their careers. He'd already had his shot at music, even if it had been cut short. Whatever happened now, he'd already gotten more than he deserved. The host took the stage and gave a speech about how impressed the judges had been with everyone's talent. Then he started announcing the results in reverse order. 3rd place went to the Rachmaninoff prodigy, the teenager whose technical skill had been flawless. The kid looked disappointed but accepted his trophy graciously. 2nd place went to a young woman who'd sung an opera aria so beautifully that several people had cried. And now for 1st place, the host said, opening the envelope the judges had given him. He looked at the name and his eyebrows went up slightly. He glanced over at the judges' table and the concert pianist judge nodded firmly. This is unusual, ladies and gentlemen. We have a unanimous decision from our judges, which is rare. 1st place goes to performer number 17. For a second, he didn't move. He couldn't have heard that right. But then people were turning to look at him, and the stage manager was gesturing for him to come forward, and somehow his legs were carrying him back out onto that stage. The host shook his hand and gave him a trophy, but more importantly, an envelope. Inside was the grand prize, a contract with a recording studio in the city, a real chance to make music again. The audience was standing again, clapping again, and he stood there holding the trophy in his scarred hands, and this time he didn't try to stop the tears. But the most unexpected moment came after the ceremony, when people were gathering their things and heading out. The teenage boy who had mocked him at registration, the one with the expensive suit and the superior attitude, approached him nervously. His parents stood a few feet back watching. "Hey," the boy said, his voice much quieter than it had been that first night. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what I said at registration, for laughing. I've been playing piano since I was 4, and I thought I knew what music was supposed to be, but what you did up there." He shook his head. "That was real, that was actually real. I've never played like that, I don't know if I can." The man looked at this kid, probably 17 or 18, so young and so certain about everything until an hour ago. He remembered being that age, thinking talent and technique were all that mattered. Life had taught him differently. "You will," he said quietly. "When you've lived enough to have something to say, you'll find your own voice. Don't rush it, and don't confuse perfection with truth." The boy nodded slowly, taking that in. His mother stepped forward then, her eyes red like she'd been crying. "Thank you," she said. "I think my son needed to learn that lesson." Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. The recording studio wanted to meet with him right away. They were talking about an album of Beethoven pieces, recorded in a way that emphasized emotion over technical perfection. A local news station picked up the story, and suddenly he was getting calls from people he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. His family, who he'd been too ashamed to contact after the accident, reached out. His younger sister drove 6 hours just to see him play at a small concert the recording studio arranged. The shelter volunteer who'd given him access to that tiny practice room came to the concert too. She sat in the front row, beaming with pride like she'd always known this would happen. Afterward, when he tried to thank her, she just hugged him and said, "You did this. Those broken hands of yours had a story to tell, and you found the courage to tell it." 3 months later, he was standing in a professional recording studio, preparing to record the Moonlight Sonata for his album. The engineer was checking levels, making sure everything was perfect. The piano was the best he'd ever played, a concert grand that cost more than he could imagine. But he wasn't nervous anymore. He knew his hands weren't perfect. He knew his technique had limitations. But he also knew that wasn't what mattered. The engineer gave him a thumbs up, and he placed his scarred fingers on the keys. As he began to play, he thought about that rainy Thursday evening when he'd walked into the community center, carrying a crumpled flyer and $200 in small bills. He thought about the mockery, the doubt, the voice in his head that said he should just give up. He thought about how close he'd come to listening to that voice. And then he let it all go and focused on the only thing that really mattered. The music. Not perfect music, not technically flawless music, but honest music. Music that came from someone who'd been broken and had found a way to create beauty anyway. 6 months after that, his album was released. It didn't top the charts or make him rich, but it found its audience. People who'd struggled themselves. People who'd been broken and were trying to put themselves back together. People who needed to hear that perfection wasn't the goal, that you could be damaged and still have something beautiful to offer the world. And sometimes, late at night, he'd think back to that teenager at the showcase, the one who'd mocked him and then apologized. He wondered if the kid had learned the lesson he was trying to teach. That music wasn't about impressing people or proving you were better than someone else. It was about being brave enough to show people your heart, especially when it was scarred and imperfect. Especially then, because that's when it was most real. That's when it mattered most. And that's when people could hear not just the notes you were playing, but the truth underneath them. The truth that survival is its own kind of victory, and finding beauty after devastation is its own kind of triumph. His hands would never be what they once were, but they'd become something else, something that could speak a different language. Now one that resonated with people who understood what it meant to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. And in the end, that was worth more than all the perfect technique in the world.